I am doing a series of sermons this summer on the early attempts to make sense of the cross. The cross is the central symbol of the Christian faith, and yet it has been the greatest obstacle to understanding the Christian faith. To be sure, the greatest obstacle. Early attempts to understand it are really important to getting at what the cross means. And so, our morning lesson is going to come from the scene of the trial of Jesus before Pilate and before Herod. Luke chapter 23, and I will be reading the entirety of this trial scene, 1 through 25. I invite you to follow along in your pew Bible. In fact, I would invite you to get that out. The page number will be in your bulletin. And follow along with me this trial scene. Then the assembly rose as the body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." And Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout Judea from the Galilee, where he began to take, for these things began to take place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some kind of a sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answers. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought this man as one who is perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, again said to them, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found in him no ground whatsoever for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been in prison for insurrection and murder. And he handed over Jesus as they wished. This is the word of the Lord. It's a mob scene by any account. And we've all encountered mobs in our lives, haven't we? Mobs are as important to understand as they are horrifying. Do you remember the scene in To Kill a Mockingbird when the mobs came to the jail to lynch Tom Robinson, who had been falsely accused of sexual violence against white woman. The black man, Tom Robinson, became a scapegoat. A scapegoat. And that's the theme that I'm picking up today. We've seen scapegoats throughout history. Mobs love scapegoats. They seem to have them. I wonder if what is going on today in our country and across the globe, perhaps even in England, the scapegoating of immigrants, the scapegoating of the poor, the outcast. I wonder if we're becoming a mob. I wonder if that was behind the election in England, in Britain, to depart from the EU. Is it? Maybe. Scapegoating. It's a reality with which we all know very well, if you think about it for just a moment. It's certainly what was happening, it seems to me, with this mob in our gospel lesson this morning, the scapegoating of Jesus. Pilate, seeing no fault in him, gives into the crowd to pacify them. To pacify them. How often have you seen it happen that a mob is pacified by a scapegoat? Happens all the time. Right there in the middle of the Gospels, right there, the key scene in the Gospels, and they let somebody who was convicted of insurrection and murder go free. Interesting, isn't it? So the notion of the scapegoat was early on in Christianity as an image to try to make sense of what was the greatest failure, seemingly scandal of the Christian faith, which is the cross, the notion of the scapegoat. And so that's what we're exploring a little bit this summer. I've been fascinated with early Christian attempts to understand the crucifixion. It is captured in nous in the story a little bit later in Luke's gospel, the story of Emmaus, where two men were leaving Jerusalem, saddened, disciples of Jesus, saddened by his crucifixion. The resurrected Christ comes to them. He is not recognized by them, and then he interprets his life, death, and resurrection in light of the law and the prophets, the Old Testament. And I have suggested to you that this in nous, it's what's going on in the entirety of the New Testament. It's midrash in light of the life, death, crucifixion of Jesus, taking the Old Testament and weaving it into his life. And the image before us today is the notion of the scapegoat. It has long been recognized that the scapegoat was a part of Jewish ritual. There are correspondences, not exact correspondences, between the notion of the scapegoat and this trial scene with Jesus, but they're interesting enough. If you know the Day of Atonement, the story in Leviticus chapter 16, it says that a goat was driven out into the wilderness because of the fear and the guilt of the people. They placed it on the goat, and it's driven out into the wilderness, and it brings peace among the people. Now, the correspondence between that ancient scene in Leviticus and the trial scene of Jesus is clear. What is not, where there's not a correspondence is that the goat is neither tortured nor killed. It is simply driven into the wilderness. But there's enough of a correspondence that many people have seen this notion of Jesus as the scapegoat as an interpretive key for understanding who he is. Two modern scholars in particular have made a lot about this. One, a British scholar by the name of Francis Young, and the other, a French philosopher by the name of René Girard, who talked about the scapegoat. Girard developed this into a whole theory of violence in society. He says that cultures actually develop around scapegoats, he says, because of jealousy, because of envy, because of rivalry. Attention builds, and one against the other become all against the one. The one victim is pointed out that is the source of all of the problems, and that victim is scapegoated, often killed or driven out. René Girard sees this in all cultures and in all places, and in particular sees it in this scene from Luke's gospel. It's all there. Pilate says he's innocent. The people say, no, 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 kill him. Why? Because of all that he did, upsetting the status quo, eating, standing on the side of outcasts and sinners. Jesus was a person that was an easy scapegoat for all of them. And so they placed him in that position, and he was crucified as such. Both Rene Girard and Francis Young suggest that this is one of the early Christian attempts to make sense of the crucifixion, that Jesus was the scapegoat. Now, what's really interesting about this for both Girard and for Young is that Jesus as scapegoat does this amazing thing. It uncovers the depth and the darkness of human sin. It uncovers the darkness because what we see in the crucified Christ, we see elsewhere in society in varieties of ways. We see it in the bully, whether that bully is in the schoolyard or in the corporation. We see it behind all of the isms of our world, racism, sexism. We see it behind all of these things. We want to get a scapegoat, according to Girard and Young. It's part of who we are as a people, the dark side of who we are. It exposes, they say, that dark side. And if you've been listening to me talk about the cross, you know that this has been fairly influential, somewhat, on my own understanding of the cross as I use as I refer to the notion over and over again that the cross reveals, exposes the little crosses, large and small, that litter the landscape of the world. Abuses of power here and there. The scapegoat is found. The scapegoat is the black person. The scapegoat is the woman. The scapegoat is the gay person. A scapegoat that will bring peace and pacify society, will allow the status quo to exist. But according to Girard and Young, something really powerful happens because of the scapegoating of Jesus. It's what Jesus does from the cross, and then what happens afterwards. You remember in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." You see, according to Girard, the scapegoating is unconscious. We just do it. We've got to find a figure to put all the tension on. We've got to find something to blame on all of our ills. It's unconscious, but we do it. It becomes part of our world and part of our culture. But as it is exposed, we can see it for what it is, and then something dramatic happens. There is forgiveness. Forgiveness from that same scapegoat. And then the scapegoat does something even more extraordinary. The scapegoat, Jesus, creates a community of nonviolence. Creates a community that goes about exposing the scapegoating violence of our world. Creates a community that stands against in resistance to that kind of reality. It is a very powerful notion. And Rene Girard goes as far as to say that the biblical notion of the scapegoat and the new community that is formed around it is this historical core of resistance to violence in our world, is that historical core. Now on this 4th of July weekend, I can't help but be reminded that at the core of who we are as a country are Jewish and Christian values, right? Right? I mean, it could be, we say, that the core values that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, come from something of a Christian value. The unassailable value of each and every human life. Now, to be sure, it's a flawed vision. It's a flawed vision because it says all men are created equal. And to be sure, those early Christian fathers did not have in mind women or slaves or children or the disabled. Didn't. But there was a core there. A core there that found ground. It was like that mustard seed that will grow up. And look how far we've come since those early days, and yet we still have so far to go. The reality of immigrants in our midst is a case in point. To what extent will we stop scapegoating? And it does seem to me, especially on a weekend like this one, that we as Christians have work to do. Yes, we do, because we have our own founding document. As our country has a founding document in the Declaration of Independence, we have our own founding document, which is the Bible. And in the Bible are the seeds of resistance to all the violence of our world, are the very seeds of a theology of the cross that can heal us all. Martin Luther, in his brilliance, talked about how the Christian church has a duty. A Christian church has a duty. And so in his 95 Theses, he preached against the theology of glory and suggested that the theology of the cross is that which will ultimately, is the only ultimate salvation for people. And this is why he said that, because he saw the theology of glory working in his society and in his church. The theology of glory is that which will bless the status quo and the violence of the status quo, the scapegoating that goes on. It will bless it and enshrine it and let it go. Martin Luther went as far as to say that the theology of glory calls evil good and good evil. But the theology of the cross is that point of tension. That point of tension that is in our tradition, that is enshrined on the symbols of our churches, that should remind us that we are a community that stands with the scapegoat. We come from the scapegoat, and we stand with the scapegoat. We are a community of faith that stands with the outcast. We stand with the immigrant. We stand with all of those who would be targeted in our world, because that's the kind of people we are. We grew out of that, and that's what we're called to be in our world, a people of the cross. And we can be a healing people. We can be a people of forgiveness and reconciliation, and that's not an artificial forgiveness and reconciliation. That's not a forgiveness and reconciliation that lets things go. It is a forgiveness and reconciliation that exposes the evil for what it is. That's what Martin Luther said the theology of the cross does. It calls a thing what it is. It calls evil what it is in order to heal it, to bring reconciliation and peace. And that's what the table is for us, you know. That's what the table is. It's a place that we come and we remember the Last Supper with the disciples before Jesus went to his death. It's the place where we embody the kind of person that he was, so that we can be that kind of person for our world. And as we are embarking on a electoral campaign that could be the nastiest in history, we have a job to do. We have a job to do. And it seems to me that job is exposing the stuff out there for what it is, the polarizations, the stuff that stigmatizes whole groups of people. We have a job to do, to point to the one who himself was stigmatized, was scandalized in this horrible, horrible symbol, and made by these early Christians, and can be for us, into a symbol of healing, reconciliation, and hope. Amen.